The call came from a number I didn't recognize, on a Tuesday evening in March, while I was heating up leftover pasta and listening to the rain hit the kitchen window. "I'm Nathan. I'm 34 years old, I'm an architect, and until that Tuesday I believed my marriage was, if not extraordinary, then solid. Honest. A thing worth having." I almost didn't answer. The voice on the other end was a woman's, calm, deliberate, the kind of calm that takes effort to maintain. She said her name was Priya. She said she was sorry to be calling. She said she had been seeing a man named Connor for the past 4 months, and that Connor had told her, 2 nights ago, that he was in love with someone else. A married woman. He had said her name. He had said Melissa. I stood in my kitchen with the phone pressed against my ear and the pasta going cold on the counter and the rain coming down outside, and I didn't say anything for what felt like a very long time. Priya waited. She wasn't crying. She wasn't angry. She sounded like someone who had made a decision and was seeing it through. "How long have you known her?" she asked finally. "Melissa." 6 years, I said. "We've been married for 6 years. Another silence. Then, "I'm sorry. I thought you should know." She hung up before I could ask another question. I put the phone down on the counter next to the pasta. The rain kept hitting the window. The kitchen was the same kitchen it had always been, the tile backsplash Melissa had picked out, the shelf of cookbooks she never used, the framed photograph from our honeymoon in Lisbon hanging beside the refrigerator. Everything in exactly the right place. I stood there looking at that photograph for a long time. Then I sat down at the table, and I began, for the first time in 6 years, to actually think. Let me tell you who Melissa was to me before Priya's call, because the version of her I'm about to describe is the only version I knew for most of our time together, and it deserves to be recorded accurately before the other version takes its place. We met at a mutual friend's rooftop party in the summer of 2017. She was wearing a yellow dress and talking to someone she clearly found boring, and when our eyes met across the rooftop she excused herself from the conversation without a backward glance. I found that thrilling at the time. I found almost everything about her thrilling at the time. She was quick-witted and restless and physically beautiful in the specific way that makes you feel chosen when she gives you her full attention. And she gave me her full attention that whole first evening, and for weeks afterward, and eventually for years. We were engaged within 14 months. We married in September 2018 in a small ceremony in the garden of her parents' house in Columbus. There were 62 guests. Gail, my sister, gave a speech that made half the room cry. Melissa laughed through most of it, that real, unguarded laugh I'd fallen in love with on the rooftop. I was 31. I thought I was the luckiest man in that garden. The first year of marriage was genuinely good, as far as I could tell. We were busy. I had a major commercial project that consumed most of my working hours, and Melissa had recently started a new position at a marketing firm downtown. She was ambitious and energetic and frequently absent in the way that ambitious, energetic people are, and I accommodated it because I believed, without really examining the belief, that two people who both had full professional lives and trusted each other required very little maintenance. That was my blind spot, I understand now. Not ignorance. Not stupidity. A deliberate philosophical commitment to non-interference that I dressed up as maturity. I didn't ask questions because I had decided questions implied distrust. The first thing I noticed, and noticed without examining, was the phone. Melissa had always been someone who kept her phone close, which I'd attributed to professional habit. But in our second year of marriage there was a new quality to it, a specific physical attentiveness. She tilted the screen away without apparent thought, she silenced it rather than letting it ring, she left the room to take calls she later described as work-related. None of these things were, individually, evidence of anything. Together, they formed a pattern I had no framework for, so I built no framework. Looking back now, that was the first signal I filed away in the wrong drawer. Not because I lacked the capacity to read it. Because reading it would have required me to ask the question I wasn't ready to ask. Connor was her colleague at the marketing firm. I met him twice, once at a work function in early 2019, once at a birthday dinner for someone in her office. He was affable and unremarkable, the kind of person who occupies space at a party without generating much impression. I had no feelings about him because he didn't register as a category of concern. Our second year of marriage contained one moment I have thought about many times since. We were at Gail's house for her daughter's birthday. My niece was turning 4, the kind of party that involves a lot of sugar and a great deal of noise, and Melissa stepped outside to take a call. She was gone for nearly 20 minutes. When she came back, she said it was her manager, a deadline had shifted, she was sorry. She touched my arm when she said it, a light, habitual touch, and I accepted the explanation entirely. Gail caught my eye across the room. She had a specific expression, not suspicious, not alarmed, just watchful. I looked away. I didn't ask Gail about it until much later. In our third year, a new variable arrived, our neighbor Drew. Drew had moved in 2 doors down in the spring of 2020. He was 36, recently divorced, good-looking in an uncomplicated way, and very present in the neighborhood. He was always visible, washing his car, working in the small garden at the front of his house, waving from the driveway on weekend mornings. Melissa liked him. She said so. She said he was easy company, that it was nice to have friendly neighbors, that the street had felt too quiet since the Pattersons had moved away. I agreed. I had no reason not to agree. The first time I felt something was a Sunday in October. I came back from the hardware store earlier than expected and found Melissa and Drew in our kitchen. They were standing at the counter, not close, not touching, but there was something about the speed at which they separated when I came through the door. Just a half step back. The conversation shifted immediately. Drew was returning a mixing bowl he'd borrowed. She'd just made coffee. Did I want a cup? I said yes. I sat down. We all talked about nothing for 15 minutes. He left. She washed the cups. Something shifted inside me that afternoon, quiet, unlocated, like a change in air pressure before weather arrives. I didn't name it. I poured the feeling back into the container I kept it in and put the lid back on. That was the behavioral pattern I had built for myself: contain, defer, maintain equilibrium. I was good at it. I had been practicing it for years. I understand now that equanimity is not the same thing as wisdom. One keeps the peace. The other tells you the truth about the peace you're keeping. Priya's call broke something open, but it didn't immediately clarify anything. The night she called, Melissa was at what she described as a work dinner. Her team was pitching a new client. She'd be home by 10. She came home at 10:15, slightly flushed, slightly careful in the way she moved through the kitchen, and I watched her from the doorway of the living room and said nothing. I had made a decision in the 3 hours between the call and her return. I was not going to react. Not yet. I was going to find out what I was actually dealing with before I said a single word. This was partly strategic and partly the oldest habit I had. She kissed me on the cheek. She asked if I'd eaten. She said the pitch had gone well. I watched her face while she spoke, that face I had looked at every day for 6 years, and I saw what I'd never been willing to look for before: the smoothness of the performance. Not lies, exactly. Not what I'd imagined lying would look like. Just a surface that was always slightly too composed, too ready with answers. I told her I was tired and went to bed. I didn't sleep. The following day, I called Gail. I didn't tell her about Priya. I asked, as casually as I could manage, whether she had ever had a feeling about Melissa, whether anything had ever struck her as off. There was a pause on the line that told me everything about the question before she answered it. "Nathan," she said, carefully. "What's going on? Just answer the question." Another pause. "I've had moments," she said. "Small things. I never wanted to say anything because I thought I might be reading into it. And because, she stopped. Because what? Because you didn't want to hear it, she said. You've never wanted to hear anything complicated about her. You know that about yourself. I did know that. Having it said out loud was a different experience than knowing it privately. Gail mentioned the birthday party, my niece's 4th birthday, the phone call that had taken 20 minutes. She had watched Melissa come back inside and had thought, that wasn't work. She said she'd told herself it was probably nothing, that she wasn't willing to damage my marriage on a feeling. She said she was sorry she hadn't said something. I told her not to be sorry. I told her it wasn't her responsibility. But privately, I added her silence to a list I was beginning to compile, a list of moments when the truth had been almost visible and everyone, including me, had looked away. Over the next 2 weeks, I started paying attention in a way I never had. Not dramatically. No surveillance, no confrontations. Just a quiet, careful reversal of my own long-standing policy of not looking. What I found was mundane in its particulars and devastating in its accumulation. Melissa's phone, which had always been kept face down or angled away, now sometimes had notifications that appeared and disappeared too quickly. Not texts, something else, an app one didn't recognize from what brief glimpse I got. She had, I noticed, begun leaving for work 15 minutes earlier than her schedule required, and returning later, and the explanations for both were different each time: traffic, a meeting, a colleague's problem, a gym class she'd mentioned only in passing. The gym class was on Tuesdays and Thursdays, she said. I checked the gym schedule online. The class she described didn't run on Thursdays. That detail seemed small. I logged it and kept going. One evening she was in the shower and her phone buzzed on the nightstand. I didn't pick it up. I stood 3 feet away from it and watched the screen light and go dark and told myself I wasn't the kind of person who looked through his wife's phone. That was true. It was also, I was beginning to understand, a distinction that had served her interests far more than mine. I thought about Drew. I hadn't thought about him deliberately since the October afternoon in the kitchen. Now I replayed the image, that half-step back, the too quick normalization of the scene. I thought about the frequency with which his name appeared in casual conversation. Drew mentioned the new restaurant on 5th. Drew said the winter this year was worse than last. Drew's going to help me carry the bookshelf down from the attic, he offered. He had been in our house. Without me. I sat with that for a night and felt something harden inside me, not anger yet, or not only anger. More like the sensation of a decision being made below the level of thought. The way a load-bearing wall makes a sound you don't consciously hear before the building shifts. I want to be clear about something before I describe what came next, because it matters to how I understand my own behavior in this period. I am not, by default, a suspicious person. I am not someone who enjoys investigation or conflict or the particular unpleasantness of looking for things you don't want to find. What I did over the following 3 weeks was not natural to me, it ran against every instinct I'd cultivated across a decade of adult life. I did it anyway, because I had finally understood something important: the cost of not knowing was not neutrality. It was a steady, invisible tax on everything I had. I started with Connor. Priya had given me his name. I knew what firm he worked at, I'd been to that office party in 2019. I found him on LinkedIn without difficulty. I spent 30 minutes looking at his profile, not out of any specific purpose, just trying to construct a more complete picture. He was 33. He'd been at the firm for 4 years. His profile photograph showed a man who looked like he spent time outdoors. There was nothing in it that helped me. What helped me was a conversation I had with Marcus, a friend of mine from my graduate program who had stayed loosely connected to Melissa's professional world through a mutual client. I didn't tell Marcus what I was looking into. I mentioned Connor's name as part of a casual work context, asked if he'd come across him. Marcus said he'd met him at an industry event the previous spring. He'd seemed decent enough. Then, after a pause, he said something that he clearly thought was small. Wasn't he and Melissa at the same conference back in February? I think someone mentioned seeing them. February. She'd told me the February conference was a solo trip, a 2-day seminar in Cincinnati, professional development. She'd stayed at the conference hotel and been back by Sunday evening. I said yes, I thought they might have been. I got off the phone and sat in my car in the parking lot of my office building and felt the architecture of the last 6 years rearranging itself around a new structural principle. The red flag I had missed most completely wasn't a single moment. It was a pattern, the way certain conversations always resolved too cleanly. She was never vague in ways that created questions, she was always vague in ways that foreclosed them. There's a difference, and I had never seen it until now. When people are genuinely busy or distracted, they leave gaps, loose ends, unexplained transitions. Melissa's stories never had loose ends. They were finished. Seamless. The seams were inside. I drove past Drew's house on a Thursday evening at 7:30. Not to catch anything, or not only for that reason. Partly because I needed to know whether my own mind was manufacturing things. Melissa had said she was at the gym. Her car was not in our driveway. I noted that. I drove to the end of the street and back. When I passed Drew's house the second time, I saw her jacket on the chair visible through his front window. I know the specific quality of that jacket. Navy blue, slightly oversized, a small embroidered patch on the left sleeve from a design conference she'd attended 2 years ago. I had bought her a coffee mug from that conference. I had been proud of her for going. I drove home. I sat in the driveway until she came back 40 minutes later, slightly flushed, hair freshly arranged, telling me the gym had been unusually crowded. I said that was too bad. I went inside and cooked dinner. That night, after she was asleep, I looked at the conference hotel's booking system through a back channel I knew from a project I'd done for a hospitality group the previous year. I'm not proud of that. It was a use of professional access that I wouldn't defend in any other context. But I found what I was looking for. Melissa had checked into the Cincinnati Conference Hotel on Friday evening. Connor had checked into the same hotel on Friday evening. They had checked out on Sunday morning within 20 minutes of each other. I closed the laptop. I lay in the dark next to my wife of 6 years and looked at the ceiling and understood, in a way that was no longer theoretical, that this had not been a single mistake. This was a pattern. The conference wasn't an anomaly. Connor wasn't an anomaly. Drew, I suspected, wasn't an anomaly. The affair hadn't begun partway through my marriage. The thought arrived quietly and with terrible completeness. It had begun at the beginning. Even now, thinking about that moment, something goes very still inside me. Not the sharp pain of discovery, that had already happened. Something colder and more permanent. The recognition that the life I'd been living had been a different life than I thought, from the very first chapter. I chose a Saturday morning. Not because Saturday held any particular significance, but because Saturday mornings were the time when we were most ordinarily ourselves. Coffee, the newspaper she read on her phone, the particular slow routine of a day with no external structure. I wanted the conversation to happen in the plainest possible version of our life together. I wanted nothing theatrical. She was at the kitchen table when I came downstairs. Coffee already made, phone face down beside her cup, sunlight coming through the garden door. She looked up when I came in and smiled, that practiced, easy smile, and said good morning. I poured myself a coffee. I sat down across from her. I want to talk about Connor, I said. The smile didn't vanish. It recalibrated, a subtle shift, like a camera finding a new focal point. She said, very evenly, what about him? I want to talk about Cincinnati. A beat. 2 beats. She looked at her cup. Nathan. I know you were both there, I said. I know you checked in on the same evening and checked out 30 minutes apart on Sunday. I know Priya called me 3 weeks ago to tell me Connor told her he was in love with you. I paused. I've known for 3 weeks. I've been thinking about how to do this. She was very still. And I want to talk about Drew, I said. Something shifted in her face then, not guilt, exactly, but a kind of release, as if the weight of the performance had finally become heavier than whatever she'd been protecting. She set her phone aside. She looked at me directly. How long have you known about Drew? Long enough. Nathan, it's not, she stopped. Started again. It's complicated. I know it's complicated, I said. That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking how long. The silence stretched. Outside, a car passed on the street. The coffee maker clicked as it finished its cycle. Drew and I, she said slowly, have been, something, for about a year and a half. And Connor? Longer. She looked at her hands. On and off. Since before the conference. Since when? She didn't answer immediately. I waited. I had become, over the past 3 weeks, very good at waiting. Since the first year, she said. We were at the same conference in Chicago. It just happened. And then it kept happening. The first year of our marriage. The year I had thought was genuinely good. Has there ever been a time, I said, and I heard my own voice as if from a slight distance, level, almost clinical, has there ever been a time since we got married when you weren't doing this? She looked at me, and I watched her measure the question and decide against the easy answer. That, at least, was honest. No, she said quietly. Not really. I nodded. I had prepared myself for this answer. I had sat with it for 3 weeks as a hypothesis, had tested it against every memory I had arrived at a place where hearing it confirmed felt less like a blow than like a door finally opening onto a room I'd known was there. And still, even prepared, even certain, the word landed in my chest with a weight I hadn't fully anticipated. Not really. 6 years. A wedding in her parents' garden. Gail's speech. Lisbon. The photograph on the refrigerator. Not really. Why did you marry me? I asked. She looked genuinely pained by that question. I believed the pain was real. I had no doubt, in that moment, that she was capable of real feeling, that some version of what she'd had with me had mattered to her. That was almost the worst part. I loved you, she said. I do love you. That's never been untrue. But it wasn't enough to be faithful to. She didn't answer that. There was no honest answer that helped her. I stood up. I took my coffee to the counter and poured the rest of it down the sink. I stood looking at the garden door for a moment, the garden she'd helped plant, the raised bed for herbs, the small stone path we'd laid together one spring weekend 3 years ago. I'm going to need you to move out, I said. I'll give you 2 weeks to make arrangements. We don't need to do this loudly. Nathan. I've thought about it, I said. I've had 3 weeks to think about it. There's nothing you can say that's going to change this. She was crying by then, quietly, without performance. I didn't doubt the tears. I also understood, with a clarity that felt almost impersonal, that her tears and my decision existed in entirely separate places and that one did not speak to the other. I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed. I looked at the room we'd shared for 6 years, her things on the nightstand, her robe on the hook behind the door, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not rage. Not grief, exactly. Something more like the deep, exhausted calm that follows a long structural inspection when you finally understand what you're working with. The building couldn't be salvaged. That was the assessment. And the assessment, however painful, was finally accurate. Melissa moved out on a Thursday, 12 days after the Saturday conversation. She took what was hers. She left what was mine. She was, in the logistics of departure, considerate and efficient, the same way she'd always been when she wanted something to go smoothly. I watched her carry boxes to her car from the living room window and felt very little that I could name. There was a kind of gravitational finality to it. Each box that went into the car was an incremental subtraction, a methodical reduction of the life we'd assembled together, until eventually the car was full and she closed the trunk and stood on the driveway for a moment without turning around. Then she turned around. She looked at the house. She looked at the window where I was standing. I didn't move. She got in the car and drove away. The divorce was handled through lawyers and took 7 months. There were no children to arrange custody for, no major assets to fight over. We had a house with equity I'd largely built through my income, and I kept it. The process was as undramatic as the marriage, in hindsight, had been dramatic beneath its surface. Gail came over the week Melissa left. She brought food I wouldn't have to cook and sat at the kitchen table and didn't say much for the first hour. That was the right instinct. After a while she said, "I should have told you sooner. What I was thinking at that birthday party." "It wouldn't have changed the timeline much," I said. I wasn't ready to hear it. "When did you get ready?" I thought about that. When the cost of not knowing became more visible than the cost of knowing. She looked at me steadily. "That's a very architect way to put it." I found the photograph from Lisbon in a drawer 3 months after Melissa left. The two of us on a viewpoint above the city, late afternoon light, her head slightly tilted toward my shoulder. We looked happy. I believe we were happy, some version of happy, in the specific register available to a person who is maintaining a parallel life. I held the photograph for a while and then put it back in the drawer. Not to preserve it. Just because throwing it away felt like a gesture the moment didn't require. I restarted a few things that had quietly atrophied during the marriage. Long runs on Sunday mornings. Cooking properly. Spending more time with Gail and her family. Reading in the evenings instead of filling the silence with television. My niece, who was 9 by then, asked me once why I seemed different. She said I seemed less busy, which she appeared to consider an improvement. Children read the room in ways adults have learned to ignore. There was no dramatic recovery. No pivot point where grief became resolution. It happened gradually, the way buildings settle, a millimeter here, a quiet shift there, until the structure finds its new equilibrium and holds. I think about the man I was before Priya's call sometimes. Not with contempt, he was doing his best with the framework he'd built. But the framework had a fundamental error in it. He had confused the absence of conflict with the presence of peace. He had mistaken a quiet surface for still water. Those are not the same thing, and knowing the difference is not something you can be told. You have to walk through the experience of being wrong about it. I walked through it. I came out the other side with fewer illusions and more precision. About what I wanted. About what I'd accept. About the difference between a life that looks intact and a life that actually is. The photograph is still in the drawer. Some days I barely think about it. Those days are becoming more common. That feels like enough. This story presents a particular kind of betrayal that is harder to process than a single catastrophic affair, precisely because it has no clear origin and no isolated cause. Melissa had never been faithful, not once, not from the beginning. Which means the question the story ultimately asks is not what went wrong but something more unsettling: was there ever a right to go wrong from? The psychology of Melissa's behavior points toward something more specific than simple moral failure. Her pattern, multiple parallel relationships sustained across the entirety of the marriage, maintained with seamless composure and genuine affection, suggests a person for whom emotional intimacy and physical loyalty occupy completely separate categories. She loved Nathan, this seems true. She was also constitutionally unable, or unwilling, to allow that love to function as a boundary. The fear she carried, the fear of emotional confinement, of identity consumed by commitment, manifested not as withdrawal from the marriage but as a private parallel life that allowed her to experience connection without ever fully surrendering to it. She kept one foot outside every room she entered. This is not a justification. It is an explanation, and the distinction matters, because understanding the mechanism of betrayal is not the same as forgiving it. What the story reveals about Nathan is equally important. His conflict avoidance was not passivity, it was a philosophy, deliberately constructed and consistently maintained. He had decided, consciously or not, that a good marriage was a marriage in which questions were unnecessary. That trust meant not asking. That smooth surfaces were evidence of depth rather than concealment. This is a form of self-deception that is extremely common and extremely costly, because it places the entire burden of a relationship's integrity on the other person while allowing the narrator to feel virtuous. Nathan was a faithful husband. He was also, for 6 years, a willfully incurious one. Those two things coexisted, and the second enabled the first to be exploited without limit. The moment that functions as the story's true point of no return is not Priya's call. It's the Thursday evening when Nathan drove past Drew's house and saw Melissa's jacket through the window, and drove home, and cooked dinner, and said nothing. That moment crystallized what he already knew. He had the information, and he had chosen, one final time, the familiar comfort of not confronting. What changed after that was not what he knew but what he was willing to do with it. The call from Priya had made not knowing impossible. The jacket in the window made not acting impossible. The confrontation that followed was almost a formality, the visible surface of a decision that had already been made somewhere quieter and deeper. What the story ultimately reveals about trust is this: it is not simply belief in another person. It is the ongoing willingness to test that belief against reality. Trust that has never been tested is not trust, it's assumption dressed in trust's clothing. Nathan's trust in Melissa was real, but it had been deliberately insulated from any evidence that might challenge it. That insulation was the architecture of their marriage, and it was an architecture designed, whether intentionally or not, to serve her needs far more than his. By the end, Nathan does not emerge as a triumphant figure. He emerges as someone who has finally, at some cost, learned to see accurately. That is a smaller and more durable thing than triumph. What I find most quietly devastating about this story isn't the affairs themselves. It's the timeline. The fact that it started at the beginning. Because that means Nathan was never living the marriage he thought he had. He was living something else entirely, a performance of a marriage, sustained for 6 years by his own willingness not to look too closely. And here's the thing about that. He's not unique in it. Most of us have something in our lives we've decided not to examine too carefully, because examining it might change something we depend on. The question this story leaves with me is a simple one: what are you choosing not to see right now, and what is that choice costing you? Not every surface that looks calm is peaceful. Sometimes it's just unwatched.